Awesome. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the webinar tonight with Kyle Claussen from Resolve. We're talking about salary data trends and contract tips. My name is Rainey McNeely. I'm the Physician Engagement Specialist here at Practice Match. If you've ever submitted your CV for review, or if you attend any of our virtual or in-person career fairs, you might have met me. Um, I just wanted to remind everyone that tonight's event will be recorded, and I'll send a recording to your emails by the end of the week. Your microphones are also muted and cameras are off, so if you have any questions, make sure you put them in the Q&A chat box. Again, your microphones are muted and your cameras are off, so just put all of your questions in the Q&A chat box. Looks like we have some people on, so if you're ready, Kyle, go on ahead.
Okay, very good. Appreciate it. Happy to chat with all of you virtually. I do want to make sure this is interactive as much as possible for you. So I know she mentioned the Q&A a couple times already, but I would much prefer to answer your questions than to just go through this. So at any point in time, please use that. If you don't know anything about Resolve, I'll give you a quick overview on that first. I am a health law attorney, and through Resolve, we've represented over 10,000 physicians in physician contract negotiation and contract review. I'm married to a physician. I've got 3 kids, young kids. I'm the CEO of Resolve, which is a legal tech company. And this is my dog, Murphy, on the screen for you guys to take a peek at. So what Resolve does is it gives you a tool to utilize to not only get some instant risk analysis on your contract, to look at red flags, to use an AI that's been trained specifically for physician contracts, but it also gets you access to compensation data and the information that you need to know whether you're being paid fairly. So it gets you access to not only survey data like MGMA's information, which I'm sure you're aware of, but also peer-to-peer data and verified contracts, and it can help you connect with attorneys that specialize in this area. So that's what we do. Now, I want to walk you through for the next 15 to 20 minutes, just kind of my view on physician compensation right now, physician contracts, and then let you ask questions for as much time as you need to. So with that being said, I do think it's useful to understand the landscape. I do think if you're out in the job market, right, you're using some of the career fairs, maybe with Practice Match, you're likely going to see different types of contract based on the different types of employers that are out there. So depending on specialty, you may run into academic practices, practices that are owned by private equity. There's still private practices that are out there, even though that's a minority. And each of those come with different factors and different types of terms in their contracts. So when we think about private practice, usually you're seeing, excuse me, you're seeing values and dollar amounts that are lower, so guarantees that are smaller, in exchange for possible ownership at some point in time, more autonomy. You're working with colleagues, not administrators or large admin teams, as opposed to everything that's in the top left here, which would be health systems, academic centers, private equity practices, where you don't have any ownership. Okay, but you do have usually more guarantees, potentially more recruitment incentives and things like that. Okay, so your goal is to push your contract and the terms of your contract as far to the top in the right on this graph as you can. Okay, so how do we do that? The first thing we should do is we should identify risk in the document. So there's lots of tools out there now that you can utilize for that, including the instant review on resolve.com. But the things that we think are important, once you've done that, once you're talking to an attorney, clients are almost always going to be dissatisfied first in this first column, right? Column number 1, which is, what is the job supposed to look like for me? What is my location of practice? Is that well defined? And meaning, do I have 2 or 3 satellite locations, or am I at one core location? How many days of the week am I working? How much call am I taking? Okay. A lot of physicians now too have interest in side gigs, and so if you plan to do that, whether that's moonlighting, whether that's doing anything social media wise, if it's working with industry, any of those qualify, and we want to make sure that we know if your contract allows for you to do that, or if it doesn't allow for you to do that unless you get permission. Okay, that would also include any type of intellectual property that you might create. Okay, so that's kind of category number 2 in this column. And then the third thing would be any type of time allocations that you want to carve out. So if you're in academics, if you need time for admin, right, charting, research, teaching, all those things matter. Your FTE status or your full-time equivalent, should be adjusted accordingly for how much time you're going to protect in each of those categories. So you may see things like zero point 0.9, right, or 90% of your time for patient-facing obligations, and then 0.1 for admin. Okay, so 36 hours for patients, 4 hours for administration. That would be a fairly typical breakdown that we would see. Okay, same thing for supervising APPs. Some clients really like this. Some physicians want to utilize APPs in their practice, and some have a very different, position on that, and they don't want to supervise at all. I'm not here to tell you that that's right or wrong or how you want to practice, but I do think your contract will dictate whether or not you have a choice in that, and whether or not the employer can just tell you to do those things if they need to. So, issue number one or category number one is solve for everything that touches your day in and day out. All your duties, all your responsibilities, any type of side gigs you want to do, time allocations, and supervision. Okay. Category number two is you need to pay attention to how the contract will end. Exit strategy is important. Most physicians now being employed, right? 80% of you are going into a job that's not private practice. And so what that means is you're likely going to have multiple contracts throughout your career, and potentially multiple employers. We know that there's a lot of, M&A activity, health systems combine, private practices get bought. Okay. And so if we're going to have different employers, I need to know if I don't like an employer, how do I get out of this? Okay. And so the first thing to think about is how much notice do I have to give? There's usually two different types. There's for cause termination, which means you did something wrong, or there's without cause, which just means, right, I need to give a certain amount of notice before I can transition. Okay, so we have to know what both of those time periods are, and also what the caveats are around a termination for cause. The second area is once we know how we can get out of the contract and how it terminates, we need to know what our financial obligations are. And the first financial obligation that I have you think about is tail coverage. That's for your malpractice insurance. If you don't know what tail is, it essentially says I need insurance to cover me for the entire statute of limitations until patients can no longer sue me. Okay, because I can make a mistake on my very last day of work, and that patient has usually between 2, and if it's a minor, right, 18 potential years to file a suit against you. And so I have to have insurance to cover that entire time frame. Who pays for that? Those are fairly expensive policies, right? Because you're covering potentially a long time frame. For some specialties like OB, it can be a six-figure number that we're talking about. So not something you want to miss in your contract. So how is tail defined, right? And who's paying for that? The second thing that I have you think about is if you took any type of signing bonus, relocation allowance, student loan repayment, right? Any of these incentives that are out there, do I have an obligation to pay that back or not? Okay. And is that repayment prorated? Is there exceptions to when I don't have to pay it back? Like if the employer is a bad actor, for example, or if the private practice sells out to private equity or gets merged, do I still have an obligation to repay those things? The general default rule is going to be that the employer has said, yes, you pay it back no matter what. Okay. And so, again, if you're uncomfortable with that and or if the timeline is too long, you want to get that reduced as much as you can. Okay, the third thing to think about in a termination or in an exit is, am I restricted from practicing somewhere, right? And this is the non-compete issue. We've got a specific slide on this next, but we have to understand the impacts of non-competes, what they are, what we should look about, what we should think about as far as geographic areas, okay, because these are a major issue, okay? And then the last thing I'd have you think about is if there's a force majeure clause in your contract, those are sometimes fine, and sometimes very problematic. And what a force majeure clause is it says if there is an act of God, which includes pandemics, right? So think about COVID. If that happens, we can void the contract, right? We're not obligated to perform in that scenario. Sometimes we see those drafted in a one-way fashion where the employer can get out of the contract and or the employer can change compensation, right? We saw those things happen during COVID, and we want to make sure you're protected in that area and you're thinking about that. Okay. So those are the major termination pieces, but I do want to touch on non-compete specifically for a second. Non-competes have gotten a lot of attention in the last few years, specifically the FTC ruling that came out and tried to ban them on a nationwide basis. That has since been challenged. It's in an appeal right now, and so at this point, every state gets to make their own rules on whether or not non-competes are allowed for physicians. Some states, roughly 10 states at this point have at least limited them to some extent for physicians, but most just enforce them if they're reasonable. So what does reasonable mean? It means if the time, so this is time post termination. So if it's 1 or 2 or 3 years, usually that falls within a reasonable amount. If the restricted area is reasonable, right? So if it's 1 mile, 2 mile, 10 miles, 100 miles, right? What is reasonable? Is the scope reasonable? Meaning, what are you allowed to do? And then also, are there any exclusions? Meaning, it doesn't apply in certain scenarios. So when we think about non-competes and when we think about the expansion of not only health systems but private practices as well, academic centers, the footprints now are very big and there's usually multiple locations. So you have to be very careful on which location they're drawing the radius from. So if it's a 2 mile non-compete, for example, but there's 7 different circles that are on your map, right? It's actually probably a 14 or 15 mile non-compete. And so language really matters in this area. You want to be very careful on this, especially if you're in a location where you have to be. You've got kids in school, you've got a spouse with a good job, right? It's hometown, you don't want to leave. There's lots of different scenarios that our clients talk to us about why this is sometimes the most important thing in their contract. And the FTC would probably agree with you because they think that in certain markets, because of the lack of competition between health systems and enforcing these non-competes, that physicians are losing out on about 37% of their total compensation, which equates to roughly 9.3 million over a career, a six-figure number, because physicians are disincentivized from terminating and breaking a contract because they have to stay in that geographic locked area. Okay, so they're unwilling to renegotiate, they're unwilling to walk right from the contract. So before you sign a contract, make sure you're very much aware of what you're getting into and that you're comfortable with it. Okay. So let's talk about category number 2 on how we are going to get paid. Okay. This is probably maybe the more fun stuff. This is a graph for you on what we see currently and the occurrence rate of different types of compensation. So most contracts are now going to have some type of base salary with a production bonus included in that. Production bonuses vary, work RVUs or collections or gross charges. We'll talk about how to break that down in a minute. You're also very likely to see signing bonuses, relocation allowances, obviously the normal benefits like CME, vacation time, health insurance, retirement plans, right? All those are very normal. So everything from the gray line here and up, very, very common. If you're not seeing those in an offer, it would be very normal to ask for it. Now, things below this are less frequent. Doesn't mean that you can't ask for them and that you shouldn't ask for it. It just depends on your situation. Okay, so you may see quality components in a contract. You may see supervision payments. So if you're going to supervise an APP, they'll pay you a flat sum per year per APP. You may see student loan forgiveness, retention bonuses, and even stipends while you finish training. Okay, and so all of those things are available depending on location. If you do see a quality bonus in your contract, I would tell you to be careful on how that's structured. A lot of those are very subjective. And so if it's making up a big percentage of your total comp, right? So if you can think about like 20% or more of your total compensation is tied to quality that you may not have full control over. To us, that would be I think, a red flag, right? You want to minimize things that you can't control. And what I mean by not being able to control it, it's things like patient satisfaction or being a good team member. Right? It's just things that you likely will be, right? And that there will be no problems on, but it's also not something that you can control objectively. Okay. So those are the different categories. Now, when you're talking production and when you're talking how am I paid and how do I evaluate whether or not I'm being paid fairly, I want you to just walk through one example on a work RVU model. Okay, this is just a way to track your production and how we think about comparing data to what your contract says. So if we go down the left column first, the work RVU column, and we have a contract in this example with a base salary of 200,000 and a production threshold of 3,000 work RVUs, which also says once we cross that threshold, we get paid $40 for every work RVU thereafter. Okay, so that's the example. Now, if we go look at the data, and the data says, well, the median for your specialty for this area is 200,000, right? That's great, kind of checks the box. But the production, right, in this area is 2,500 work RVUs. Okay, so there's a 500 work RVU discrepancy in that example from what the data says versus what your contract says. Now, if you know that every work RVU is worth $40, and let's assume that that's the normal value, the way I interpret that is that you're short $20,000, right? 500 times 40, as opposed to what your peers are making in a similar location. So even though the guarantee is there, the guarantee is tied to more production than what your colleagues have. Okay, so that we think that would be short, right, about 10%. And you can go through that same type of analysis on a collection model, on a billing model, on any model to compare what are my requirements when do I bonus, right? And then what am I paid once I bonus? And all three of those things should check off. So if you produce at the 80th percentile of production, right, you're a high producer, you would also expect then to earn, right, roughly the 80th percentile. Those things should be linear to some extent. Okay. So where do we go to find out what's fair, right? What are my options for looking at data and information? There is three categories. Again, in my mind, the first category is what I'm going to call survey data. So this is I'm going to call it unverified information, but it's coming in larger kind of swaths. MGMA, AMGA, Sullivan and Cotter, AAMC. These are big surveys that employers are feeding their information into for benchmarking purposes. You likely will see some of these referenced in your contract specifically. And so we think you need to have access to it, right? If your employers are using those things, you should also have access to those as well. Those are released about one time per year. And actually, the new surveys just came out early June, so they're only about a week old right now. And these are used for fair market value compliance. So compliance meaning Stark law and IRS regulations that say we need to pay physicians fairly, right? We can't pay for downstream referrals. And so they will utilize those for compliance. Okay. So that's one set. The other piece of data that I think you should be looking at is what you would find on resolve.com. This is verified information from contracts that we reviewed. It's de-identified, it's anonymous, but it's real, right? You can trust it. People have looked at it, we know that it's in there. Okay, so this is sourced from physicians directly. There's no bias. We're always right on the side of our clients. Okay, and this is a live stream. So every time there's new data that comes in, you can take a look at that. Sometimes what we'll see with the larger surveys is that they are dated, right? There are certain specialties, like in this last year, anesthesia, radiology, right? They really outpaced, right, what the surveys were doing. And so I think it's useful to have access to live information. Okay. And then the third category, which is also live information, but it's even better than the stuff that we talked about before, it's having multiple offers. Okay. If you're in a practice match, a career fair, or you're talking to an employer from a job on practicematch.com, this is information that's applicable to you. It gives you leverage. It's verified. It's real. And it's also going to be live and usually geographic specific, right? Hopefully, if you're moving to pick your city, Denver, right? You're going to have talked to everybody in Denver. You're going to know exactly what that market looks like for you at that time frame. So we think if you mash all of these together, right, you'll have a pretty good idea of what you should be paid. Okay. Now, this slide, um, if you were on camera and live, I'd ask you to answer this of the question of what is the median. But because this is more of a Q&A format, I won't make you type this all out. This is a trick question. Okay, all of these numbers are medians out of an MGMA survey. So when your employer or when you're looking at data, it really matters what your filters are. It really matters what you're looking at. There's over 250 filters and different ways to sort this information. And so if somebody says, well, we're paying you the median, that's a fairly loaded statement. Okay. And so you're going to want to analyze specifically what your situation calls for. Sometimes you can't drill down far enough into these data sets. And so you have to use a broader category. But again, all of this is for one specialty. And so it can range from 312 to 160. That's a pretty big gap, right? And so you want to know what's applicable for your spot. Okay. So some trends that we've seen in the data. Now, this is again for one specialty. You can see this for others as well, but you can see how total encounters, apparently really went down in 2024. Okay, along with production and gross charges and collections. However, when you look at the very bottom of this, the total compensation didn't move much. Okay, and so what I'm putting this up for is just that sometimes to let you know the data doesn't always make sense. It's not always linear. It's why you're going to want to have multiple categories again to look at and multiple sources, because it doesn't make sense to me how I can see 15% less, right, people or patients to have my gross charges go down by more than that, and my production to go down by less than that, but my compensation not move. Okay, so those things don't always line up. So just be careful what you're looking at. Make sure you have multiple sets to take a look at. And if you were just coming out of training, right, or if you're anybody, I guess, in the market that's curious on what this looks like, these are example snapshots from the platform. So when you hop in, this is available instantly. You can go look at it right now with an account. You can see different percentiles. You can see and toggle between work RVUs and collections. You can see what you should be paid by region. You're also going to have access to live stream of salaries that are out there. Okay, and then we would encourage you to use all of your resources to find as many job offers as you can, including practice match. Okay. So your final step, hopefully you've identified risk, you know where to find information on data. You got to decide if you're going to negotiate. Okay, how am I going to go about asking for changes? What should I expect in that process? The big thing that I would tell you to expect first off is that everyone, regardless of size, is going to tell you that they have one contract that they've ever used, it's standard, and that nobody adjusts it. Okay, that is rarely true. So we see changes in about 85% of the documents that we review. These are examples on this slide on correspondence that we've had with in-house counsel and or what we've seen from physicians dealing with recruiters and employers. The example on the left is essentially an organization saying, hey, we can't make any adjustments to your base or work RVU, thinking that the physician is going to say yes to that. The physician turns it down, says, hey, I appreciate you considering me. And then all of a sudden, they're willing to reevaluate, right? And to take a look at compensation again. So sometimes it takes pushing them, unfortunately, to the walkaway step before those changes will be made. You would hope that that wouldn't be the case, but sometimes that happens. Okay, so you need to be prepared for that. The second thing, that you'll see in here is that our non-compete never changes. I've included an example on the right here of how we've had in-house counsel say we've, had lots of people verify this. We think it's a very good non-compete, right? And it's been vetted. But in this situation, in this case, we are going to make a significant rare accommodation for your client to do that. So you're never going to know unless you ask. Okay. And I think there's, unfortunately, in some of the physician communities that are out there and online groups, there's this stance that somebody else, one of my colleagues, didn't get a change, and so therefore I won't either. You're not going to know your situation until you ask, because at any point in time, supply and demand can be different for your organization and for your specialty. So it would behoove you to utilize any leverage that you've got to ask for those things. The other thing that I would tell you is that everybody, and when I say everybody, I mean every employer, likely has a fair market value consultant that they're using. They're gonna tell you that they've talked to somebody who did a survey, right? That they've gotten essentially an appraisal, right, for the position, and they can't provide you with that analysis, but just to trust them that it is at fair market value, and we want you to come work here. And that's why we think it's so important to have your own access to this stuff, to make sure you're kind of trusting but verifying, to some extent, because they're not going to give you the same reports that they have. Okay, and the question comes up often is this worth it? Do I want to go through the process of asking these hard questions? I would encourage you to do that and to pay attention to your career, especially because you're no longer, the most of you anyway, are no longer going to be in private practice where you're not owning it. You don't get to control and make all the decisions. You're now an employee. You've shifted, some of the risk, right, of practicing onto these institutions, but they're also supposed to then pay you hopefully at a fair market value rate. If you're 10% low for your career, I'm estimating 25 years, you're going to cost yourself over, $2.5 to $3 million, depending on specialty. So we think it's absolutely worth it to pay attention, right, to this, to make sure you're reviewing your situation, at least annually, but certainly before you're moving, right, into any new spot or anytime you get a new contract. So with that, I've taken my 22 minutes and I will answer questions for as long as you need to. If you don't feel like putting a question in because it's too personal, feel free to use the email that's on here. It's kyle@resolve.com, and I'm happy to try to answer those offline as well. So with that, I will go to the Q&A, and you can ask anything you'd like. Or Rainey, I don't know if it's able or if you're able to unmute them, but I'm happy to answer questions that way too.
Let's see. I think we have one question that just came in. It says, how complicated is it to break a non-compete?
Yeah, potentially very complicated. So it's going to depend on how it's written, first of all, but depending on the state that you're in, and depending on the case law and history that's there, um, the employer, if it's a reasonable mileage, right, you're going to have a very tough time. Now, they don't always enforce them, meaning they could have a 10-mile non-compete. There might be a case on point that says, yes, 10 miles is okay for physicians. But they may still decide that because of all the FTC action and because of the attention that they're getting right now, that they feel that that's unreasonable. I think there's again, from what I see in here in the physician communities, there's a feeling that no employer enforces these, right? People get out of them all the time. They can't be enforced. That's not my experience. I mean, we have plenty of employers that have sent letters saying, hey, if you violate this, we're going to go after you. Here's the damage amount. We've already, kind of pre-calculated it. So I would tell you to be careful and try to prevent it on the front end, right? It's like, I mean, anything else in medicine, right? It's preventative care. Take care of the non-compete up front, and then you don't have to worry about it on the way out. Sometimes it's easier said than done, right? I understand that, but I do think you want to address it and not assume that it's unenforceable. Um, okay, a few more coming in now. How often do employers take back the contract if there's too many proposed changes in the contract? Not often. So the question is if you go in and you mark up, let's say every single page, right? You got changes to every paragraph. How often do employers pull those? The answer is rarely. I mean, if you're doing that and they've got a lot of candidates, right? Let's say they've got 5 or 6 candidates. It's a high demand area. Um, they likely will come back and say, no, we can't, right? And they may mean it, right? This is one of those cases where it might be a standard contract and that they're not going to change. But to have them pull it is pretty rare. I actually think it's a red flag. So if an employer is that offended that you would go through it and try to advocate for yourself, I likely would encourage you that that's not an employer that you're going to want to work for long term because they had an attorney draft the document. And so it'd be pretty odd to have them be offended by you reviewing it, especially when this is your career, right? This is a uh, you know, 6-figure job, which with a 2 or 3 year term can be $1 million value, right, to you. And so you've got to be very careful on that. So does it happen? Yes. I mean, we've seen it happen. Is it very often? No. I mean, I would say it's less than 1%, right? That's gonna come up. Okay. The next question is lots of center hospitals don't have recruiters assigned with them, and all the offers are in rural areas. Should I contact HR of the hospitals? I've got a lot of friends. So this is kind of a who should I negotiate with question. My suggestion on that is you just go back to whoever gave it to you. Okay, so if you got it from a recruiter, if you got it from HR, if you got it from the CEO, right? I think that that's the right person to go back to in that setting, and they'll direct it on the right person to get it to at that point in time. Sometimes it goes to legal, sometimes it has to go to a comp committee, right? It just depends on organization and the setup, but you won't be doing the wrong thing by going back to who gave it to you. Okay. Okay. What are the pros and cons of shift-based versus a salary, kind of a guaranteed contract? Um, well, I think there's two questions. If it's shift-based and you want to be flexible with the amount of shifts you're working, I think then that's fine. You can get there with a salary as well, right? I mean, you could set a rate and say I have to work 15 shifts a month. So that part doesn't matter. Now, if you're talking about purely a more of a flexible setup, like a PRN setup or a locum setup, um, then I think those are rarely salaried, right? I mean, they're going to say, hey, however many shifts you work, we're going to pay you X number of dollars per shift. I think if you're talking production versus guarantee for something that's not shift based, right? So not ER, not hospitalists, not things like that. I think you really have to understand how much volume is going to be there because if you're on a heavy productivity contract, right, something that is really shifting most of your compensation to that production, and there's not enough patients in the area, or you've got a bad payer mix if you're on a collection model, that can really affect your total comp. So I think you just have to be careful and understand your specialty, the area, right, and what's important to you individually. Okay. How do you figure out what a competitive signing bonus is for your specialty, what that should look like? My suggestion would be, and I'm going to go back a couple slides so you can see this, I mean, this is biased, right? But go to resolve.com. I mean, you're going to see not only what MGMA says as a signing bonus median, but you're also going to see, probably more importantly, a live stream of what's being offered. And you can see these are real examples. In internal medicine, right? Depending on state, depending on location, they're ranging from $20,000 to $100,000, right? And sometimes you assume, well, I'm in California, so it's going to be the smaller amount. Well, no, actually, the very last example is California has something that's higher than Illinois, right? And higher than New Jersey and higher than Wisconsin. So my suggestion, if you don't have multiple offers, if you don't know, right, based on your interviews, you need to have access to something like this. And it's a very low price point. And I think Practice Match is going to send out a discount for you guys too. I mean, the ROI on this is going to be pretty big for you. Okay? What's your opinion to look out for after contract renewals? I think you mean on a contract renewal. Um, so my suggestion is that you pay attention to your production, you pay attention to what the market's doing. So we talked about the data changing every year, right? And on kind of a live basis at times. So if you're 2 or 3 or 4 years behind fair market value, I mean that can be, you know, 20, 30, $40,000 pretty quickly, right? Because a 10% shift in some specialties is going to be worth $40,000 per year, right? So my suggestion is on a renewal, you need to take a look at your snapshot, right? What have I done? What is my specialty doing, right? What are the offers that are out there today? Again, that's the platform will let you do that and access that, and then decide if you need to renegotiate. If you don't need to, if your contract is still fair, I think it's great. Put it back in the drawer and keep going. If not, I mean, I think it's time to raise your hand. So we encourage you to monitor this on like a once a year basis, right? We think that's important. Okay. Um, This is just a statement. 250,000, I think, is the median for family practice outpatient. I love it. So we had a slide on that. I would tell you go check the information. It may be, it may not be. I think you got to double check that. Okay. Other questions, please continue to throw them in there. I'm happy to answer if I can. Dr. Valdez, I don't have the ability to bring you on screen. I'm not sure it's allowing for that right now. So I think you'll have to type the questions in. Do we have a Resolve app in the App Store? Unfortunately, we don't. Right now, it's just a web app. So you can go to resolve.com and you utilize it that way. Um, maybe that's coming down the road, but as of right now, no. Using a contract lawyer, any tips or advice? My advice on using, if you're not going to just use the platform, if you're going to connect with an attorney, whether it's us or any other attorney, is connect with them early. Okay, don't connect with them 3 days before you need to sign your offer. That puts you and them in a very tough spot. Okay, and so it's very likely that you're going to have questions for them based on their review, based on their suggestions. It's likely that you're going to get multiple versions, right? The employer is going to make some changes, but not others. And so I think you want to be very honest with your attorney. Don't hide information. We have had clients do that. It's not a good outcome. It's like when patients don't tell you the full story. There's no reason for it. I mean, we have no conflict of interest. We're helping you and representing you. So start early, full disclosure, right? Get the help that you need when you need it, and not too late. And I think you'll have a good outcome. But I think just be very clear with them on what your expectations are. For private practices who structure bonuses based on net collections, what's a good way to understand how the collections are determined, and on average if others in the group bonus in their first few years? Yeah, so if you're going into a private practice, they should be able to show you, rough production from the last two hires. They could, block out the names and make it anonymous. They should have good accounting and profit and loss statements to show you what others have earned, right? But I do think if you're on a collection model, patient allocation becomes important. So if you're the new person coming in and you get all the Medicare Medicaid patients versus all the Wellmark, right, or Blue Cross patients, your reimbursement or your collections is going to be very different for doing the exact same work, right? And so you want to be careful on how that happens and have them explain to you how new patients are coming in and being screened. Sometimes it's not that big of an issue, right? Sometimes it can be a fairly dramatic issue. How do we find a good RVU compensation rate? Like if we're offered 40, how do we tell if that's a good offer? Okay, so again, I'm going to keep. I'm not trying to sell you on this, but all these things are on resolve.com. Okay, so if you hop on there, you can get access to the instant. It's called an instant review. Okay, it's less than $200. It's going to show you medians for work RVUs. It's going to show you how much how much your colleagues are producing. So like this is an example. I don't know what specialty it is, but this specialty earns $400,000 on roughly 4,300 work RVUs at a rate of $87. Okay. Now these numbers will all change once you're in the platform. It's going to toggle by region. It's going to toggle by academics or not, right? And so you can see differences in first year versus years 2 and beyond. You're going to see signing bonuses and relocation allowances, right? CME time, vacation time, right? All those data points are there for you. Now, you can also go and see individual contracts. So when you pair those two things together, you should have a pretty good idea whether $40 is the right number or if it's way off, right? I mean, like in this example that's on screen, if you were offered 60 and had no idea, well, you're actually at the 10th percentile. It's, almost $30 low, right? And so you don't want to be in that situation. Okay. Tanner says, what leverage do we have, if any, as new graduates without a fellowship to negotiate a contract, say for general surgery? Besides just trying to get a fair market price salary, how can we negotiate a higher salary or benefits? I think you, I think you're asking about going actually into practice, right? Not a fellowship contract. If you're going into fellowship, that contract not really negotiable, right? It's the value is not very high. But if you're talking about I'm going out and I'm going to be a general surgeon, your leverage is as good as anybody else's. Okay, so there's a shortage in almost every specialty right across the country. Now there are certain markets and certain locations where your specialty might have saturation, but that's really rare. So your leverage and your reimbursement that's coming in from what you're doing is no different as a new grad than it is if you've been out 10 years, right? When you submit a CPT code, it doesn't say how long have you been in practice, right? It's just here's a CPT code, here's what I do with the patient. And in turn, right, you're reimbursed from the payers at the same way, right? They don't pay you more or reimburse you more because you've been in practice for 10 years. So as a new grad, I mean, obviously it takes you time to ramp up, right? And so that'll be the argument that you may not be as productive in year one, which is true, right? And probably true. But by the month 9, 10, 11, right, at the end of that first year, you hopefully will be very productive. And so I think your leverage is just as good or close to just as good as someone who has experience. Okay. Um, I'm applying for a J1 waiver job. Okay. Any things I need to look for, specifically ask, negotiate. Um, if you're looking for a J1 waiver job, so this is if you're an internal medical grad, international medical grad, and you need a J1 waiver, my suggestion is start early, right? The federal year resets October 1, which means a lot of times you're going to need to have a contract signed. So negotiated and signed by late August, early September to make sure you can do all the immigration pieces that follow after that. So number one is start early. Number two, depending on where you're going and depending on what specialty, there's different sponsoring organizations. So there's Conrad 30 program, there's an ARC program, there's a DRA program, right? There's a handful of those that are out there. Some of those have limitations on how many they can accept by state. Sometimes it's an unlimited number. Sometimes there are specific contract requirements of what can and cannot be in the contract. So just make sure you start early, make sure you have a good immigration attorney with you, make sure you obviously have an employment contract attorney help you with that. But I think you have just as much leverage, right? I don't want you to think that you don't or you shouldn't be paid, fairly. There's a little bit of additional cost, right, that goes into an immigration filing, but it's not dramatic, right? It's not something that should cost you a huge value in your salary. Okay. Next question, is it true that fall is the time for new offers to come for the next year? All offers are currently in rural areas, especially Texas, I think, or Texas. So it depends. I mean, I think most employers know that residents and fellows are on this June, right, end of June, early July timeline. And so they know that in order to recruit them and to not be behind the game, that they're going to start extending offers in early fall through, early spring, right? So kind of that September to April timeframe is when most of the offers are going to be negotiated and signed. So now is not too early, in my opinion, if you're going into your last year. But certainly, if you get to September, you ought to be heavily interviewing and looking at offers. Okay. Is it more appropriate to negotiate verbally with the employer or to send the markups from the contract lawyer for portions of the contract that you'd like adjusted? I think both are appropriate. I think it's easy to see changes in like a red line format or suggestions from an attorney. I also think they always prefer to talk to you if they can, right? And so if you're willing to kind of piece both of those together, you'll probably get the best outcome. I think you need to know your personality. If you're willing to, answer questions, right? If they say no to something, are you willing to counter that, or not? But I do think it's worth your time to do and to be ready to do both. Okay. What's taken into account in physician compensation with competitive experience, salary breakdown, living expenses, state taxes, etc. So the numbers that we're showing, right? Like when you see a median on this slide, um, this is taxable income. So this would include anything from, not only production bonuses that are out there, but if there's, um, repayment, student loan repayment, things like that, anything that's W-2, right, is going to fall into that category. Now, there's benefits on top of this, right? So retirement accounts, malpractice insurance, right? All those other things are in addition to these numbers that you're seeing. So sometimes employers will try to quantify those and to say, hey, look at all these other nice benefits we're giving you. That it should be taken into consideration. I mean, I think those are absolutely true values, but when you compare side by side surveys to what they're offering, it needs to be whatever is taxable on that, not the non-taxable benefits. Um, if you're talking about how do I compare offers side by side with living expenses and state taxes, that's a very personal question for you, right? I mean, you can live in, Texas or Florida and have no state income tax, or there might be cost of living places that do have state income tax that are less expensive. So I think that's just very, very, very personal. Okay, let's see what else is here. How do we leverage multiple contract offers for more competitive pay and bonus? Well, I think it should hopefully speak for itself. But if you've got two offers or more, you'll be able to see side by side what terms are better in each contract. And so you should be, if you're absolutely, it's kind of a 1A and a 1B where you're interested in both. I mean, I would be asking the question of, can you match this or can you get closer to it? Because I have two offers that I really like. Yeah. How much can we expect to pay for a contract lawyer? Um, Again, our pricing is flat fees. So you can go to resolve.com and see, what it costs to have one contract looked at and to have an attorney, talk through that with you. There's also a different price point for if you want that attorney to help you negotiate, and there's also a different price point for if you have, like four or more contracts, or you want to have 12 months of service. Most packages on our site are less than $2,000. It just depends on how many contracts you have and what you're looking for. Um, but again, go to resolve.com, click on pricing, and you can see all that. Okay, I think I got to most of them. Is there anything else? Other questions that you guys have? Okay, I'm going to go to the last slide again, just in case there's things you don't want to ask in here. Kyle at resolve.com. Feel free to use that. Check out the website. We hope you use Practice Match and get lots of offers because we think that's good for you. It's fun for us when people come in and they have two or three things that they're looking at. So we wish you the best and let us know if you need anything.
Perfect. Thanks so much, Kyle. If you guys do have any questions, again, reach out to Kyle at kyle@resolve.com. And I'll also be sending this recording to all of you by the end of the week. So if you have any questions about that, feel free to reach out to me. Thanks so much, Kyle.
Thanks, guys. See ya.